Welcome to I Am Nala podcast, brought to you by Nala Feminist Collective or Nala Fem, where we strive towards the liberation of African women and girls. We are a group of feminist leaders in politics and activism with a mission to foster, embolden, and mobilize women and girls from Africa and the diaspora for transformative change. I am your host, Aya Shebi, founder of Nala Fem, and on this second season of I Am Nala podcast, we raise awareness during the 16 days of activism. We talk about Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto and its 10 demands. Welcome to another episode of I Am Nala podcast. My guest today is Yassmin Abdel-Mageid, a Sudanese-Australian writer. Hi. An engineer and activist based everywhere in the world. I don't know. I mean, you said you're in London right now, but she's everywhere. But I like how also she's described as an agitator. We're going to talk about that. And of course, she's a council member of Nala Fem since we started this journey. And we're so proud of her work and her important role in the collective. So Yassmin, how are you?
Alhamdulillah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. And yes, I like to say that I am from the diaspora. I spend a lot of time in lots of different places, but that is the thread that runs through it all.
Okay, so you started, that was my first question. How would you describe yourself in 3 words?
Oh, 3 words. Yeah, probably somebody who is, let's go with an agitator. Somebody who's very curious, and somebody who, this is not one word, but is always learning. Maybe let's say
a
that.
learner. Amazing. So let's first start with the manifesto, because we're celebrating the 16 days of activism, and we want to highlight the work you do because it's unconventional. So you are championing Manifesto Demand 7 on education, because you're actually educating the world through your published books, through your plays, I saw recently, through your writings, your voice mainly, and why education is extremely important. Of course, not the formal, the education way of learning, but broadly learning. And how did it help you to find your voice?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think for me, when we use the word education, we often think of formal schooling, whether it's primary, secondary, university and tertiary education and so on. But for me, education is about that idea of constantly learning. And it is about being able to constantly have more tools to understand the world around us, to understand the history of where we've come from, to understand how other people have, organized and done things, and also, think about where we kind of want to go collectively in the future. And it's very difficult, as human beings, we come into this world not knowing very much at all. And we have to learn in order to be able to kind of move forward and create community and so on. And we are learning at every step, from when we're with our parents, with our family from day one, all the way, throughout our life. And so through the work that I do, whether it is publishing books for, adults, essays that are really trying to interrogate contemporary cultural issues, whether it's, books for younger people where I've got characters that are very curious and in lots of different contexts, or whether it's, doing TikToks where I talk about, different social issues, all the way to conferences and keynotes around the world, alhamdulillah. I guess I'm always trying to increase the awareness and sort of raise the consciousness of the people that I'm speaking to, and also help them develop their own critical thinking tools so that they can then go on and learn themselves.
This is a great transition to my other question, which is about critical thinking and the formal, education system. You write a lot about politics, and you critique unapologetically a lot of the politics of the West. And I did my master at SOAS, the heart of the capitalist London, and I know firsthand how Eurocentric their education system is, but also on the continent, our education system is Eurocentric because we're a product of the legacy of colonialism. So how can we develop a critical thinking for kids and for generations to come, to be Pan-Africanist and not to be brainwashed with mental slavery and with this system, both in the West and on the continent that we're product of?
I think this is such an important challenge, right? Because, we can talk about the formal decolonization of the 50s and 60s, but, the next sort of challenge in the decolonial movement, I would argue, is that of, the very structures that we live in and the very, our own imagination, right? The sort of decolonizing of the mind that people speak about, and has been written about. And I think part of that is the work of giving legitimacy and credibility to all of the ways of learning and educating and thinking that might not be necessarily in the traditional libraries that that we find in European context that we're used to, might not even be written down, but understanding that what is important isn't necessarily only what's been written down, the sort of oral stories, the ways of thinking that are a bit different. So there's step one of trying to sort of go back and find what has been lost. And also, I think the challenge of trying to create again and imagine again, maybe we're using the values that we know exist in various communities on the continent, sort of breathing or rebreathing life back into them. And I really want to be cautious here, because I don't want to say that people haven't been engaging in non-Eurocentric or African-centric ways of thinking or education and so on. But it's less about saying that doesn't exist and more about saying, how do we bring that back to the center? How do we, embed that as part of our formal education process and so on? For me personally, the way that I've tried to do this is to, change what authors I read. Am I reading, like, I don't know, the Europeans, like the Charles Dickens, or am I trying to read, Abdurrazak Gurna, or like Chinua Achebe, or Tayyib Saleh, the Sudanese writer, for example? If we're looking at literature, if we're thinking about plays, are we thinking about Shakespeare, or are we thinking about stories that we might not even consider theatrical, but stories from the Quran, for example, or stories that we've grown up with that, I mean, very simple, but like even something like Juha, who we sort of laugh at and think of as a kid's thing. It's a very there's the fables and the stories in that are very powerful. So trying not to think of them as like things that we just leave at home, but bringing them and trying to sort of recenter them, I think can be the beginning of really changing how we think about education.
What you said really reminds me also of our context in the development sector, where we always tell the donors that what we write on the report is not what usually or mostly reflect what happened on the ground. And what happened on the ground might not end up in the report. So it's always about that fluidity, I guess, about your ways of learning. So I want to, because you mentioned also TikTok and you do this 1 minute with Yas, and I want to know which topic right now, political topic, that is pissing you off.
Oh my God, what isn't pissing me off, Aya? Right now, everything is very upsetting. I guess there's something that this is, something that I think is newer for me in my thinking about politics, but it's something that I want to learn more about, and is becoming increasingly relevant. Is, we're talking only a few days after COP27 finished in Egypt, and the conversation around climate change and the conversation about loss and damage and the impact that it's having on people on the continent, and the impact that, massive climate change, East Africa, you're looking at Ethiopia and Somalia and so many of these, my own Sudan, suffering from drought and suffering from the effects of the war in Ukraine, and thinking like, how are we again as people, or how are folks on the continent again suffering not due to anything that they have done, and how can we kind of shift that conversation? How do we move responsibility and accountability? This isn't necessarily something that I certainly don't have the answers to, and I'm joining a conversation that's been around for decades. But this is something that I think is only going to become more and more and more important, and how we, engage with and try to hold, former colonial nations and these industrialized nations to account, is something I've been spending a lot of time thinking about.
I'm also pissed off that. But listen, I mean, something happened. Something happened recently, right? In Tunisia, the Francophonie conference took place in Jerba, in the south of Tunisia.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if you saw it on the news, where Macron said in his opening remarks that French is the Pan-African language.
Oh, excuse me? Oh my God, the French really love to act like they're everything, huh? They really like to. Wow.
So I
Wow.
want to see something after this, on your
Yes.
Instagram.
Yeah. I've got you. I've got you. Listen. Oh my, as you know, I lived in Paris for a year, and I really getting to understand the French mentality, and especially their relationship still with the continent is like I thought the Anglophones were bad, but really the French take it to another level.
Yeah, I mean, really, if you ask me what pisses you off, it's always this continuous resistance of the French colonization and their legacy,
Mm,
and how they articulate themselves around everything African. It
mm,
it just manifests every time in different ways, and every time we say
mm,
we're opening a new chapter, and we're and they're trying, then something happens like this. Same way when he was just newly elected, and he made a tour in Africa, and there was a lot of controversy around the things he said. So I think it's in the conversation of decolonization that you're raising, that
mm,
it's the statements, it's the discourse, it's the practice, it's the everyday relationship. It's just a lot to unpack. So I want to move to talk more about, let's say, feminism, or the female, and how are we as female operating in this system.
mm,
And I think it's fascinating for me when you talk a lot about unconscious bias. I think you're one of the people who really kind of continuously raise this, because we always talk about bias but not the unconscious of it. Can you tell us more about your vision around a word free from
mm,
bias, especially as women, as female
mm,
leaders in our own rights, who are operating in today's world?
mm. Thank you for the question. Yeah, this question of sort of women's rights and gender justice, which is a phrase that I like to use. The older I get, the more I'm like, how we are having these same battles, just maybe in slightly different forms, but it is consistently this battle of what does it look like for, the genders to be equal, and for if women are doing particular roles, are they seen as less legitimate or having less credibility, whatever that role might be? Or if women are in particular positions, how are they actually being completely supported in the same way that they would if they were a different gender, and so on? I mean, for me, a world without gender injustice would be a world where every woman, can live freely and safely and make her own choices. And, they might be choices that we deem more quote unquote traditional. They might be choices that we haven't even imagined before. But also, I guess that we live in societies where your gender does not dictate the society's expectations of you, and does not dictate the way the world engages with you. I'm not necessarily a believer in just individual justice. I'm interested in collective justice. So I'm interested in us also imagining what would women who had equal power and justice in this world, what choices would they make about how they organize the society? I would love to see that. I don't know the answers to that, but I think that's quite exciting as well. So yeah, that's what we're all working towards, inshallah, right?
Yeah, I mean, probably pre-colonial Africa could have given us a lot of answers, to
Right.
that,
Yeah.
because I
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
remember, I remember recently I was in Germany on this panel, and the moderator asked, "What do you think? Do you think if the world was ruled by women would be better, right?" And I'm like,
Mm,
"But the world was matriarchal, and it was ruled by women
yeah.
in pre-colonial Africa, and they were doing great."
Yeah.
So I would love to live in a kingdom of women, to be honest.
Truly. And I mean, we have so many studies that show us that in societies where women have power and are empowered, you know, like war and conflict is massively decreased. The sort of the care for people in the societies. Of course, women are not perfect, but when you have structures defined by sort of the life givers, I think it can be very different, revolutionary.
Absolutely. So tell us about your new book, because I guess you are still touring, right? And I
Oh
don't
yes,
have a
yeah.
copy, and I'm not
Oh
happy
my
about
God. Okay,
that.
I need to, yeah, no, I mean, I clearly need to post you a copy. That's going to happen. It's on the podcast now. Everyone, you can hold me to account.
Accountability.
So it's called Talking About a Revolution, fittingly, and it's a collection of essays sort of on revolution and evolution and social justice and what I call sort of contemporary political issues. Um, and half the essays are things that I've written over my 20s, and then half of them are new essays that I wrote when I was 30. So I also can like talk about it as a coda to my 20s. You know, this is the decade of my thinking. And what I wanted to do kind of two things. One was I wanted to sort of bring up my body of work from my 20s together so people could kind of almost see how my politics have grown and changed over time and see me grappling with some of those, tricky political, like going from a more individualistic or trying to sort of, growing up in the West, that sort of model migrant mentality and grappling with what it was to be the model migrant and how to break free from that and so on, all the way to the structural conversations around, the revolution in Sudan, to what does this idea of prison abolition look like, and how does it fit with my Islamic ideals and so on and so on. And so I guess the second objective of it was to open up a bunch of conversations for people. Like I want each of these essays to be a talking point for people, and hopefully, inshallah, wherever you are on your political journey, there's something in this collection that speaks to you.
Well, we need a whole other podcast for the book once I read it
Yes.
and I have my copy. but
Perfect.
but but
Perfect.
already what you said really like makes me a lot curious, because I know you also wrote, I think, two books about Layla, which is really
Yeah.
fascinating.
So I've got You Must Be Layla is the first, and Listen Layla is the second. So You Must Be Layla is a story about a Sudanese born girl who's 13 years old. She's starting at a brand new high school, a fancy private high school in Australia. And she gets, one of the kids at school is a bit racist, and she gets into a fight with him, and then she ends up being suspended. And her goal, she has to then sort of win a robotics competition, right, in order to prove that she should stay at the school. So for Layla in the first book, it's all about her kind of discovering that she needs to listen to the people around her, and she goes on a bit of a journey around that. But the second book is mostly in Africa, mostly in Sudan. So Layla's grandmother gets sick, and they travel back to Sudan to be with the grandma, and she gets caught up in the revolution. And so she's 14 years old. Her cousins are going out to fight or to protest, and and what I wanted to explore was what is it like for a kid from the diaspora to come into a revolution, from the outside, right? And even though she might learn to care about all these sorts of things, how does she, and she has to go on this journey of being like, well, what is the right way for me to be involved? And she, I'm not going to ruin it for you, but she sort of thinks a little bit, thinks that she can come in with some solutions before she stops and listens to the people who are living in the country. And so, I think it's a some folks might think it's a bit advanced, but I think for a 14-year-old kid from the diaspora, it makes a lot of, it's the perfect kind of thing to be talking about, because you think, oh, I really want to be involved. But the question is, what is the best way for you to be involved in the revolution?
It's interesting because you're writing fiction and nonfiction at the same time, because it also speaks to who you are, right? Living in Australia and being Sudanese and so on. And I'm curious to know, I don't know if it's in Laida's story or in your story, around the myths or the stereotypes you get as a Muslim woman when you are in Australia and then when you go back to Sudan.
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't lived in Australia for a few years now, but I would say, these are the same sort of myths and stereotypes exist across the Anglophone West, which is, people have a lot of presumptions and assumptions about what people from Sudan are like, what Muslim women are like, what people who wear the hijab are like, etc. And I think a lot of my early years in organizing and in activism, I spent a lot of time trying to challenge their stereotypes, break people's stereotypes. I would constantly talk about how I was into engineering, and I made race cars, and I broke all these people's stereotypes. And I think and sometimes I still do talk about that, especially when I'm doing like introductory conversations and speeches to communities that are new to the conversation around bias and racism and so on. But I think personally, I put less energy now into trying to be like, your stereotype or your bias is this, and I'm going to show you that I'm not that. And I try to write and think about what I am interested in and then present that on its own terms. And actually also talk to the people that are from my communities rather than just talking to the dominant culture of the society that I'm in. Because I think responding directly to the dominant culture is useful. But if we're really interested in creating something transformative, then I also want to empower the people, from the historically marginalized societies that I'm a part of in the diaspora to make things on our own terms and to tell stories on our own terms. So yeah, that's been, I think, a little bit of a shift over the last few years for me. Because I'm like, part of me is like, well, the stereotype is your problem. It's not actually mine. And I'm not going to live, I'm not going to live a life limited by constantly trying to challenge. It's, that Toni Morrison quote, like the function of racism is to distract you. So the function of constantly trying to resist biases and so on, I found a little bit of a distraction. And that's what I'm trying to do. We'll see. We'll see. Inshallah khair.
I mean, it reminds me of how I also shifted my way of dealing with men, right? So like in the fight for gender justice, there's a lot of work around, educate the boys, and make more male leaders feminists and so on. And then at some point I realized I'm not going to invest my energy in that. It's not my job to educate the boys while I have a lot to do to empower the women, right? So
Exactly.
it's also taken a lot of your time, and now there are programs dedicated to that. It's take a lot of resources instead of like making women financially free and so on. So it's really, I think when you go through it, then you change your approach and you see where your energy is at. I
100%.
think that's a great also tip to girls out there, and I want to also ask you, those aspiring, right, women who look like you, who have the same faith, and who really aspire to be independent, to have a powerful voice, to find their voice, and to write, maybe be writers, especially. What would you tell them? I mean, where can they start? What should they do and do not?
I think so. I started writing online. I was one of the many people. I think you did as well, didn't you? Yeah, we had a blog, and we were writing about the world around us, and we were passionate and angry and full of, revolutionary fervor about what was going on in the place that we were living. And so that's what I did. I started online, and I think that kind of gave me the space to experiment. So my first sort of hint or tip would be find a place, whether it's online or off, where you can just start writing without thinking about the audience, without thinking about whether it's good or bad, because half the battle is literally just sitting down and starting. So many people have a book inside them, but they've never made the time. So if you just, wake up in the morning, I said to a friend the other day who told me that she wanted to start writing, I was like, wake up in the morning and just for 10 minutes, just free write, just write whatever's in your mind, and if you do that every day for a week, if you do that every day for a month, all of a sudden you've got maybe a few hundred pages, right, of thoughts and so on. And then you can start thinking, well, what is the story that I want to share with the world? How can I share that with the world? And if you put that out there, you then might also start to understand what you care about and what you want to, write more about. And the sort of the second or third tip I will give is there are so many formal opportunities out there. There are courses, there are free courses, ones you can pay for. There are residencies that you can apply to. Honestly, so many of the opportunities that I have been very fortunate that have changed my writing life, it's because I've scoured the internet and I've applied for everything. And I might get 1 out of every 10 or 20 that I apply for. But if you just put yourself out there, that's how things will change, inshallah.
I remember when me and you in Paris were talking about writing my book, and you were like, just record yourself, or let's jump on a call and just tell me the story.
Yes.
And then you have the recording, So it's really about taking that one step at a time, one day at a time, and not feeling overwhelmed. Well, I'm going to write now a book, or like, also, I think the judgment, right? Like, again, the bias, the judgment in your head, that what would people say about my writing? So then you start self-censoring, self-sabotaging yourself.
Totally, yeah.
By writing.
One of the best things that somebody said to me once was like, write as if no one will ever read this. Like, write as if no one will ever read this, because it's actually quite hard to be honest on the page, right? But the best writing is the most honest. And listen, even if I've published 4 books now, alhamdulillah, my 5th one is coming out next year. I'm still worried about whether my writing is good enough or not. I'm still worried about, whether, like, I'm still judging myself in my own mind. That doesn't go away. You just have to learn how to manage it and become friends with it, or at least tolerate it.
Well, I'm sure a lot of young women now are like writing a book every year or every 2 years. I mean, this is so productive, right? But like, how do you live as a writer? It's not easy, right? Like, people see just when you publish the book and you're touring with it, and they don't know all of the challenges you face, all of the hard work, all of the struggle with yourself to even tell those different stories. Yeah. So tell us the
Yeah.
challenge part.
Oh my God. It is, I read something somewhere where it's like writing is not hard like, building a house, but it's hard like physics. It is you're constantly battling yourself. It's a real mental workout. You're also battling like every distraction, because you have to protect your time, and there is so much to distract you, right? Like, to be able to say to people, I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk to anyone for a week because I need to sit down and write. It's very difficult in this world, Everyone wants to call you all the time. Everyone wants to find out what you're doing, blah, blah. So I, yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of difficult things in my life, but sort of living and having a career as a writer, this is why, for 1 or 2 or 3 months a year, I will be offline, and I will, not answer my emails and not answer my Instagram DMs, and probably annoy quite a lot of people, but it's because I have to work so hard to protect that time. And then even once I've created that time for myself, I'm like, oh my God, I have to sit here and I have to write. What am I going to say? It's probably going to be trash. The struggle is real. But alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
But you go through it because you really, once you want to tell that story, it comes out at some point. I think also it's about reading, and I think back to like the demand on education. When we say girls need their right to education, it means they read the right to access. Even if it wasn't the
Yeah.
school, they need to be able to read, to have, the
To
imagination.
dream, yeah, to
Yeah.
broaden your horizons. I mean, I grew up in a city in Australia where there were no other Sudanese people. There was like one other Sudanese family. The next one didn't come till 10 years later. There were, the idea of the Pan-African community didn't exist where I was growing up. And the idea of having role models and people who looked like me or had the same values as me is just non-existent. But I found my role models through books. I found inspiration through books. And there's this amazing James Baldwin quote, which is like, you think you're the only one who's gone through an experience, and then you read and you realize that your experience is like, has been written about in beautiful ways, hundreds of times, thousands, millions of times, and somehow connects you to the sort of human experience. So I'm a big, I love reading, and thank you also for bringing it up, because the best writers are the ones who I think spend a lot of time reading as well, because you learn how to tell stories, or even like listening to stories, audio books, or listening to your aunt, like the auntie who tells the best story in the house. How does she put a story together? How is she making you excited? Think about these things, and keep practicing them. Yeah.
So we can't have a writer on the podcast without asking recommendations for books.
Oh, of course, of course. Okay. So in terms of like novels, if you haven't read, I am a current big fan of Abdulrazak Gurna, who is this Tanzanian author who recently won the Nobel Prize. Like, he's the Nobel laureate last year, 2021, and his sort of the post-colonial kind of fantastic novels, quite often set in Tanzania or similar. And it's just not something that you get to read about a lot in English. So a big recommendation. One of his books is called Afterlives, and Paradise is also a really good one. The book that I'm reading at the moment, different. It's not Pan-African, but it's a fantasy young adult fiction novel called Legend Born. So if you want something very different, it's actually written from the perspective. The main character is a descendant of enslaved people, and her magical power kind of comes from, her ancestors and so on. So it's a very different kind of way of looking at a connection with ancestral grief and so on. So I think that was really, really good. And one last one, which I might get some stick for, but if you haven't read, it's called Modern Muslims. And it's actually written by this American guy. And I almost never read books by white people um, based in Africa. But he lived with Mahmoud Muhammad Taha in Sudan for like 20, 25 years. And he kind of writes about the rise and fall of that his movement, and became quite good friends with a lot of those people. And so there's just very few kind of records of Mahmoud Muhammad Taha and his kind of approach to Islam and so on in English. So that's one I would recommend.
So you're reading it to get the insight into your culture. Smart. All right, my final question to you is, are you Nala?
I am Nala because I believe in a world where women are safe and free and equal. And I want to be part of creating the gender just world, inshallah.
You're already doing it. And you're only in your 30s.
Hey.
Did you
Likewise,
actually turn 30? Did you actually turn 30?
Yes, yeah.
You did?
Look at you're so worried.
Yeah.
No, I'm 31 this year. I'm 31 this year.
In my head, you're always that, 26,
I'm like 21. Yeah,
exactly.
If only. No, my knees are telling me I'm in my 30s.
I always love life, by the way. People think that powerful women who are accomplished and achieving and traveling the world do not have any relationships.
No, as you may be aware, I did get married just before the COVID pandemic hit. And then we had, we went straight into lockdown. Allah was like, Yassmin, you want to be with this man? Well, you will be with him for all of the hours of the day. But alhamdulillah. The best thing about my not so new husband is that he gets on really well with my family, which is a big plus because they send him the WhatsApp messages now. He's in all the WhatsApp groups and I don't have to deal with the WhatsApps, and he likes to cook. So big win.
I need someone like that.
Alhamdulillah. Yes, yeah. We'll come through to London. We'll introduce you to some people, inshallah.
Yeah. Or I can send whoever I like to your guy to teach him how
to cook. Yeah. No, actually, he has actually been the wali. Like he's had a few chats with, people who've been like, oh, I want to get married to this guy. Can you suss him out? So we can do the interview process.
You've been matching people. That's a new skill.
Yeah.
Now it will become a reality show of the writer who is,
oh my God,
spreading love.
That would be great. That would be really, really good.
Yassmin, this has been amazing. Thank you for taking the time to share with us a little bit of your story because, we can't unpack all of that in just 30 minutes, but you're doing amazing and you're inspiring. And I wish you all the best in this tour of the book. And we look forward to your next book. Thank you for being on I Am Nala podcast. And if you all want to check out more information on what Yassmin is doing, you'll find all the description on nalafam.org/podcast. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.